August 25, 1944, a young Parisian woman named Simone Lacroix stood frozen at the corner of Rue de Rivoli as the first Allied tank rolled past her window. She had lived under Nazi occupation for 1,467 days. But what she shouted at the American soldiers that morning would change her life forever. And what the soldiers shouted back would reveal a secret that had been buried since D-Day. If you want to know what freedom actually sounds like after 4 years of silence, stay with me until the end of this story, because the truth is far stranger than anything you have been told. The metal beast grinding down the cobblestones was an M for Sherman, olive green and battle-scarred, with white stars painted on its hull. Inside that tank sat Corporal James Whitmore from Kentucky, a 22-year-old mechanic who had never been more than 50 miles from his hometown before the war. He could hear the roar of the crowd outside, but could not see much through the narrow vision slits. Paris was supposed to be liberated. The intelligence reports said the Germans were retreating, but Whitmore's hands were shaking on the controls because 3 blocks earlier, a sniper's bullet had pinged off the turret, and nobody knew if the city was truly free or if they were rolling into another trap. Simone pressed herself against the doorway of her apartment building. She had not eaten a real meal in 2 weeks. The Germans had stripped the city of food, fuel, and hope. Her brother Henry had been taken by the Gestapo 6 months ago. She did not know if he was alive. Her father had died during the first winter of the occupation. Her mother rarely spoke anymore. And now these tanks, these liberators, were here. But Simone did not know whether to scream with joy or run for cover, because trust was a language. She had forgotten that the Sherman stopped directly in front of her building. The hatch opened. Whitmore climbed halfway out, his helmet crooked, his face smeared with dust and sweat. He looked down at the crowd gathering on the sidewalk, and his eyes locked with Simone's. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Simone did something she had not done in 4 years. She smiled. "Are you real?" She shouted in broken English, her voice cracking. "Are you really here?" Whitmore blinked. He had expected cheering. He had expected celebration. But this girl, this stranger with hollow cheeks and eyes like bruised stone, was asking him if he was real. He swallowed hard and nodded. "Yeah," he called back. "We're here. We're really here." Simone took a step forward, then another, and then she started running. Within seconds, 100 other Parisians followed her, flooding the street, surrounding the tank, reaching up to touch the metal, to touch the soldiers, to confirm that this nightmare was ending. Whitmore felt hands grabbing his arms, his shoulders, pulling him down from the hatch. An old man kissed him on both cheeks. A child handed him a wilted flower. Simone stood in front of him, tears streaming down her face, and she said something in rapid French that Whitmore could not understand. But he understood the look in her eyes. It was relief. It was terror. It was the emotional whiplash of a city that had been suffocating and was now gasping its first breath of air. What did she say? Whitmore asked a French resistance fighter standing nearby, a wiry man with a rifle slung over his shoulder and an armband marked FFI. The fighter grinned. She said, "Tell me you are not ghosts. Tell me you will not disappear." Whitmore turned back to Simone. "We are not ghosts," he said slowly, hoping she could understand. "We are staying." But even as he said it, gunfire cracked from a rooftop 2 blocks away. The crowd screamed and scattered. Whitmore threw Simone to the ground and covered her with his body as bullets chewed into the cobblestones. The resistance fighter fired back, and within seconds, the the street that had been a celebration turned into a battlefield. Paris was not fully liberated. Not yet. The Germans were still here, dug into strongholds, desperate and dangerous. And the people who had come out to cheer were now caught in the crossfire. Simone lay beneath Whitmore, her heart pounding so hard she thought it would break through her ribs. She could feel his weight pressing her into the street, smell the oil and gunpowder on his uniform, hear him shouting orders she could not comprehend. This was liberation. This was freedom. And it was loud and chaotic and nothing like the stories she had imagined during the dark years of occupation. The firefight lasted 3 minutes. When it ended, 2 German snipers were dead, shot by FFI marksmen who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Whitmore pulled Simone to her feet. She was shaking, but she was alive. He was shaking too. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded, even though she was not sure what okay meant anymore. "Come with me," she said suddenly, grabbing his hand. "Please, come with me." Whitmore hesitated. He was supposed to stay with his unit, but something in her voice, something desperate and urgent, made him follow. She led him down a side alley, past buildings pockmarked with bullet holes, past a burned-out car, past a wall covered in fading propaganda posters. She stopped at a heavy wooden door and pounded on it 3 times. The door cracked open. A woman's face appeared, old and suspicious. Simone spoke rapidly in French. The woman's eyes widened. She opened the door fully and gestured for them to enter. Inside was a cellar, dim and crowded. 30 people were packed into the space, mostly women and children, a few elderly men. They stared at Whitmore with a mixture of hope and fear. Simone turned to him. "These people," she said in halting English, "have been hiding here for 2 weeks. No food, no water. The Germans were searching buildings. We could not leave. We thought we would die here. You must tell your officers. You must help them." Whitmore looked around the cellar. He saw faces gaunt with hunger, eyes dull with exhaustion. A child no older than 5 clung to her mother's leg, silent and unmoving. An old man sat in the corner, his breathing shallow and labored. This was not the Paris of propaganda films and victory parades. This was the Paris that had been slowly strangled by occupation, and liberation was not a switch that flipped from darkness to light. It was messy and incomplete and full of people who still needed saving. "I will get help," Whitmore said. "I promise." Simone grabbed his arm. "Do not make promises you cannot keep," she said quietly. "We have heard too many promises." Whitmore met her gaze. "I do not make promises I cannot keep," he said. And then he left, running back toward his tank, shouting for his commanding officer, demanding medical supplies and rations. Within an hour, US Army medics were in that cellar, distributing water and food, evacuating the weakest to field hospitals. Simone watched it happen, standing in the doorway, unable to believe it was real. Freedom, she realized, was not just the absence of Germans. It was the presence of people who cared whether you lived or died. But liberation was far from complete. While Simone and Whitmore were in that cellar, 3 miles away at the Grand Palais, the German garrison was making its last stand. General Dietrich von Choltitz, the military governor of Paris, had received direct orders from Adolf Hitler: destroy the city, blow the bridges, burn the museums, leave nothing for the Allies but ruins. Choltitz had the explosives. He had the manpower. But he also had a problem. He did not want to be remembered as the man who destroyed Paris. Choltitz sat in his command post, staring at a map of the city. Around him, his officers argued about whether to obey Hitler's orders or negotiate a surrender. The French resistance had been attacking German positions all week. The Allies were closing in from every direction. The war was lost. Everyone knew it, but orders were orders, and disobeying the Führer meant death for Choltitz and his family back in Germany. He lit a cigarette and tried to think at that same moment. A Swedish consul named Raoul Nordling was being escorted into the building under a white flag. Nordling was a neutral diplomat who had spent the occupation trying to save lives behind the scenes. Now he had come to make one final plea. He sat across from Choltitz and spoke calmly, logically. "You can destroy this city," Nordling said, "and your name will be cursed forever. Or you can surrender and be remembered as the general who saved Paris. History is watching you, General. What will you choose?" Choltitz did not answer immediately. He smoked his cigarette down to the filter and crushed it in the ashtray. Then he looked at Nordling and said, "I am a soldier. I follow orders." Nordling leaned forward. "You are a human being first," he said. "And this city does not belong to Hitler. It belongs to the people who have lived here for 1,000 years. Do not let him take that away." Choltitz stood and walked to the window. Outside, he could see the Seine, the rooftops, the spires of Notre Dame. He had been in Paris for 2 months. He had walked its streets, eaten in its cafes, slept in its buildings. And despite everything, despite the war and the occupation and the orders from Berlin, he did not want to destroy it. He turned back to Nordling. "If I surrender," he said slowly, "my family will pay the price." "If you destroy Paris," Nordling replied, "millions will pay the price, including your family, when the Allies win this war. Because they will win, General. The only question is how much more blood will be spilled before then." Choltitz closed his eyes. He thought about his wife, his daughters, his home in Germany. He thought about the orders sitting on his desk. And then he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. "I will not destroy Paris," he said quietly, "but I will not surrender to the resistance. If I surrender, it will be to the regular Allied forces. I am still a German officer. I will surrender with honor." Nordling nodded. "I will arrange it." Within hours, French forces under General Philippe Leclerc were advancing into the city center. The fighting was fierce but localized. German strongpoints fell one by one. At 3 p.m. on August 25th, Choltitz was taken prisoner by French infantry. He signed the surrender document in Leclerc's presence, and with that signature, the battle for Paris officially ended. But the liberation was not finished. Across the city, isolated pockets of German soldiers continued to fight, either unaware of the surrender or unwilling to accept it. Snipers haunted the rooftops. Booby traps waited in abandoned buildings, and the civilians who poured into the streets to celebrate were still in danger. Simone Lacroix did not know any of this. She was back in her apartment, sitting by the window, watching the tanks roll past. Her mother was in the next room, weeping. Simone did not know if the tears were from joy or exhaustion or the sheer emotional overload of 4 years collapsing in a single day. She thought about Whitmore, the American soldier who had kept his promise. She wondered if she would ever see him again. She wondered what happened next. Liberation was supposed to feel like an ending, but it felt like the beginning of something uncertain and fragile that night. Charles de Gaulle arrived in Paris. The exiled leader of Free France walked down the Champs-Élysées in a victory parade, surrounded by cheering crowds. Simone was there, pressed into the mass of humanity that filled the boulevards. She wanted to feel triumphant. She wanted to scream and dance and forget the last 4 years. But as she stood in that crowd, watching de Gaulle stride past with military precision, she felt something else. She felt angry, because where had de Gaulle been during the occupation? Where had he been when her brother was arrested, when her father died, when she and her neighbors were starving? He had been in London, in safety, making speeches on the radio while Paris burned, and now he was here, claiming credit for a liberation that had been won by ordinary people who had risked everything. The resistance fighters who had sabotaged German supplies, the citizens who had hidden Jewish families in their attics, the teenagers who had distributed underground newspapers. They had fought for Paris, and now de Gaulle was positioning himself as the savior. Simone turned to the woman standing next to her, a stranger with graying hair and a worn coat. "Do you believe this?" Simone asked. "Do you believe he liberated us?" The woman looked at her with tired eyes. "I believe we liberated ourselves," she said. "But men like him will write the history books. And in those books we will be footnotes." Simone felt a knot tighten in her chest. The woman was right. Liberation was already being rewritten, turned into a narrative of great leaders and heroic armies, while the people who had actually survived the occupation were fading into the background. She thought about Whitmore again, about his promise to help the people in the cellar. That had been real. That had mattered. But who would remember it? The parade continued. Suddenly, gunfire erupted from a building near Notre Dame. The crowd panicked and scattered, screaming, diving for cover. De Gaulle did not flinch. He kept walking, steady and composed, as if the bullets were irrelevant. Soldiers returned fire. The shooting stopped. Simone crouched behind a stone planter, her heart racing. Liberation, she thought bitterly, was supposed to mean safety. But Paris was still a war zone, and freedom was still fragile. She made her way home through empty streets, past overturned barricades and burned-out cars. When she reached her apartment, she found her mother sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a photograph. It was a picture of Henry, Simone's brother, taken before the war. He was smiling, young and carefree. Simone sat down beside her mother and took her hand. "He might still be alive," she said quietly. "We do not know." Her mother shook her head. "I know," she whispered. "I can feel it. He is gone." Simone wanted to argue, to insist that hope was still possible. But she had learned during the occupation that hope was a luxury, and sometimes the truth was kinder than false comfort. She held her mother's hand and said nothing. The next morning, Simone went back to the cellar where she had taken Whitmore. The people were gone, evacuated to hospitals and shelters. But in the corner of the room, she found something, a piece of paper with writing in English. It was a note from Whitmore. "Thank you for trusting me," it said. "You saved these people by asking for help. That took courage. I hope we meet again. Stay safe, J.W." Simone folded the note carefully and slipped it into her pocket. She did not know if they would meet again. The war was still raging across Europe, and soldiers like Whitmore were being sent wherever they were needed. But the note mattered. It was proof that in the chaos of liberation, small acts of humanity still existed. Over the following days, Paris began to breathe again. Shops reopened, cafes filled with people drinking weak coffee and sharing stories. The tricolor flags appeared on every building, but beneath the celebration there was a darker current. Collaborators were being hunted down and punished. Women who had relationships with German soldiers had their heads shaved in public. Accusations flew, some justified, some driven by personal grudges. Liberation was not just freedom, it was also revenge. Simone witnessed one of these scenes on a street corner near her home. A young woman, maybe 20 years old, was dragged into the square by a mob. Her crime: she had worked as a secretary in a German office. The crowd screamed at her, called her a traitor, a whore. They shaved her head while she sobbed. Simone watched, sickened but unable to look away. She did not know this woman. She did not know if the accusations were true or exaggerated, but she knew that this was not justice. This was the ugliness that lived alongside liberation. The need to punish someone, anyone, for the years of suffering. She thought about saying something, stepping forward, telling the mob to stop. But she was afraid. Afraid of becoming the next target. Afraid of being accused of sympathizing with collaborators. So she stood silent, hating herself for it, and when the mob dispersed, she went home and locked the door. That night, she could not sleep. She kept thinking about the woman with the shaved head, about Henry, about Whitmore, about all the contradictions of liberation. Freedom was supposed to be simple. Good versus evil. Light versus dark. But the reality was messy and complicated and full of people making impossible choices. Simone had spent 4 years trying to survive. She had lied to German soldiers. She had hoarded food. She had looked the other way when neighbors were arrested because getting involved meant dying. Did that make her a collaborator? Did survival require a moral compromise? She did not know the answer. 3 weeks after liberation, Simone received a letter. It had been delivered by a US Army courier, forwarded from a field hospital. She opened it with trembling hands. It was from Whitmore. "Dear Simone," it began, "I do not know if this will reach you, but I had to try. I wanted you to know that the people we helped in the cellar are safe. Most of them have been reunited with their families. The little girl you saw is doing well. Her name is Margot. She asked about you. I told her you were the bravest person I had met in Paris. I hope you are safe. I hope you and your family are finding peace. The war is not over yet, but I think we are winning. I think it will end soon. When it does, I hope the world remembers what people like you did to survive. You are stronger than you know. Take care. James Whitmore." Simone read the letter 3 times. Then she sat down and cried. Not from sadness, but from a strange mix of relief and gratitude and exhaustion. Someone had seen her. Someone had acknowledged that survival was a form of courage. She folded the letter and placed it in a drawer next to the note Whitmore had left in the cellar. They were small things, scraps of paper, but they mattered more than any victory parade. Months passed. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. Hitler was dead. Germany surrendered. The world began the long, painful process of rebuilding. Simone never saw Whitmore again. She did not know if he survived the war. She thought about trying to find him, writing to the US Army. But she did not know where to start, and part of her preferred to leave it as a memory. A moment of connection in the chaos. Her brother Henry never came home. In 1946, his name appeared on a list of prisoners who had died in a concentration camp. Simone and her mother held a small memorial service. There was no body to bury, just a name on a piece of paper. Simone stood in the cemetery and realized that liberation had not brought Henry back. It had only confirmed his absence. But life continued. Simone found work as a translator. She met a man named Luke, a resistance fighter who had lost his leg during the liberation. They married in 1947. They had 2 children. They built a quiet, ordinary life in a Paris that was slowly healing from its wounds. Simone never forgot the occupation, but she learned to live with the memory rather than being consumed by it. In 1964, 20 years after liberation, Simone received an unexpected package. It was from the United States. Inside was a letter and a photograph. The letter was from a woman named Clara Whitmore. "Dear Madame Lacroix," it read, "My father, James Whitmore, passed away last year. Before he died, he told me about the day he met you in Paris. He said it was the most important day of his life because it reminded him why he was fighting. He kept a journal during the war, and he wrote about you often. I thought you might like to have this photograph. It was taken the day Paris was liberated. I hope you are well. Sincerely, Clara Whitmore." The photograph showed Whitmore standing in front of his tank, grinning, surrounded by celebrating Parisians. And there, in the corner of the frame, barely visible, was Simone. She was younger, thinner, her face a mixture of hope and disbelief. She stared at the photograph for a long time, remembering that day, the chaos, the fear, the sudden, overwhelming realization that the occupation was ending. She wrote back to Clara, thanking her, telling her that James Whitmore had been a good man who had kept his promises. She told her about the cellar, about the people they had saved, about the letter he had sent, and she told her something she had never said out loud before, that meeting James Whitmore had given her hope when she had none left, and that hope had carried her through the darkest days of liberation and beyond. Simone kept the photograph on her mantle. When her children asked about it, she told them the story. Not the sanitized, heroic version, but the real one, full of fear and uncertainty and small acts of kindness that mattered more than grand gestures. She wanted them to understand that liberation was not a single moment. It was a process, messy and incomplete, shaped by ordinary people doing extraordinary things in impossible circumstances in her final years. Simone was interviewed by a historian, documenting the liberation of Paris. The historian asked her what she remembered most about that day. Simone thought for a moment. Then she said, "I remember asking an American soldier if he was real, and I remember him saying yes. That was liberation. Not the tanks, or the parades, or the speeches. It was the moment when someone I did not know promised me that the nightmare was ending, and then he kept that promise. That is what freedom sounded like. It sounded like a promise being kept." Simone Lacroix died in 1998 at the age of 79. Her obituary mentioned that she had lived through the occupation and liberation of Paris. It did not mention the cellar or James Whitmore or the small, quiet acts of courage that had defined her life. But her children remembered, and they told their children. And the story, like so many stories from that time, survived not in history books, but in the memories of families who refused to let it fade. Because liberation was not just about the soldiers who rolled into Paris in tanks. It was about the people who survived long enough to see them arrive. It was about the choices made in cellars and alleys and quiet moments when no one was watching. It was about promises kept and promises broken and the fragile, complicated process of rebuilding a life after everything had been taken away. And if you listen carefully, you can still hear it. The sound of freedom. Not triumphant or certain, but tentative and hopeful and real. It sounds like a young woman asking, "Are you real?" And a soldier answering, "Yes, we are really here." That is what French civilians said when Allied tanks liberated Paris. And it changed everything. Liberation is never just a single day. It is every day that comes after, when people decide whether to rebuild or to break, to forgive or to seek revenge, to hold on to hope or let it slip away. The tanks rolled into Paris on August 25, 1944, but the real liberation happened in the days, months, and years that followed, in small acts of courage that no parade could ever capture. History remembers the generals and the battles, but freedom is built by ordinary people who refuse to give up, even when the world gives them every reason to. That is the lesson Paris taught the world, and it is a lesson we still need today.